Hey, all you Ethicuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern if you think fixing our workplace can fix our world. I got a real treat for you today. Let's get a massive round of applause for the one and only Matt Kelly. He got a great topic for us. We're going to be talking about supply chain risk in 2026. We've got a couple of phenomenal guests. I'm going to run through a couple of quick announcements here. So drop that LinkedIn URL in the chat. Tell us how the weather is where you're at. Everyone, we've all in the pre-show, we're kind of complaining about the weather where we're at, but it seems like the clouds are parting here in Charlotte. Things are warming up. And drop that LinkedIn URL in the chat and connect with at least one person today. We're giving out tons of CEUs as always. So if you're with SHRM or HRCI or CCB or all three, you're going to get a bunch of credits today. And we're going to be promoting and we're going to be giving away 5 copies of this book, which I absolutely love. So Zoe Chance is a professor at Yale. She wrote this phenomenal book called Influence is Your Superpower. If you have not picked this book up, you absolutely should, or you should stay active in the chat and win one today. Our job as ethics and compliance officers ultimately is to drive influence within our organization. We need to change the human behaviors, and so much of that is really imbued within us. When we're babies, we are wildly influential because whenever we need something, we cry, and something changes as we grow where we start to kind of dim that light of influence. But I'm telling you that that's wired into you. And this book does a great job of highlighting that and giving you the confidence to drive more influence, whether it's with the employee base, whether it's with your counterparts, or whether it's with the executive team. The year in review is still live in effect. We're in Q1, and we're going to continue to push our year in review. So if you've not clicked that link in the console, you absolutely should. We have a ton of great toolkits. We're going to continue to push out as much value as we can into this market. But there's, 10 or 12 different toolkits from last year that you can pull something from. Each toolkit has a number of different components that you can utilize, of course, for free because we love you, to improve your program and drive more of that elusive influence. Stay tuned. The 2026 benchmark report is coming out right now. Our team is pounding the keyboard, doing a ton of analyses to aggregate together everything that happened last year for, across, hundreds of thousands of cases for investigation and case management. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be coming out. And of course, if you are in the healthcare space, we have enough data to have statistically significant conclusions for healthcare. So we're going to be putting out both of those reports soon. And also, I wanted to highlight our smart disclosure platform. So your job is to crowdsource this risk intelligence across your organization. So much of our job is spent doing, handwork, busy work, paperwork, when we need to try to increase the proportion of our time that's spent putting our unique gifts to work, which is really specialized risk mitigation. And so when we can get better information from the workforce, when we can boil that information to the top and really focus our eyes on the things that matter most, we can have much more of an impact and really secure our positions within our organization when there's so many economic headwinds, when there's so many belts being tightened across the economy. We have to show our value and so forth. So it's hard to show our value if we don't have the right tools. Many people are on old platforms that are, built in the 90s and things like that. So if you are looking for your plan for the next year, if you're looking for some new tools, I would encourage you to book a demo with us. Mention the Ethicsverse, and you'll get a nice little discount because we love you. And I want to share this. Our good friend, Andy McBride of Integrity Bridge, phenomenal organization. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met. He has a really cool survey going out. So I told him, I kind of already promised that you guys would help out with this. But if you can hit this QR code, we might try to drop it into the chat. But if you can spend a couple of minutes going through this Integrity Bridge compliance technology survey, that would be great. We want to, pull together some great information so that we can benchmark ourselves, of course, all of us I'm talking about, benchmark our programs and see how we can leverage technology better. So with that, hit that QR code. And while you're at it, Control-T, hop on over to the one and only Matt Kelly's Radical Compliance blog. If you're not following this, welcome to Earth. Time to get familiar with my favorite, and I'm not just saying that because he's here, my favorite compliance blog that's out there. He consistently puts out phenomenal information. If you think I ever sound smart, odds are you can Control F and find something I stole from this blog. So there's a great place to sign up on the right-hand side for the newsletter. He does not spam you. It's only great information. So Matt, with that, take it away. Coolest guy in compliance. Let's get a massive emoji explosion for Matt and our 2 new guests who have never been on the Ethicsverse before.
Thank you very much, Nick. It is good to be here again. And hello, everybody. Welcome. I am enjoying seeing all of these weather updates. For the person in Denver who said that they need some snow out there, by all means, come and take some off of my driveway here in Boston because we have plenty to spare. But We are here today to talk about supply chain risks and issues because it has been a slow building problem or challenge over the last couple of years, but it increases to become a bigger and bigger challenge every year. Certainly when the Trump administration came back and started imposing a lot more tariffs, export control restrictions, people had to think about this much more. That has not changed. So we are here today to talk about what do we even mean by supply chain risk? Is it a logistics and procurement thing? Is it a compliance thing? Is it a cybersecurity thing? Is it all three? What are you, compliance officers, supposed to do about it? What is your whole company supposed to do about it? How do you build those capabilities? That is the sort of issue that we are trying to unpack today. We do have two great speakers with us to talk us through all of that. So first is Lila Landis, and Lila is the Global Chief Compliance Officer at JAS Worldwide, which is a logistics business that is headquartered, I think, down in Atlanta. And Lila, I think you're joining us from Fort Worth, but welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Jeff Schwartz. He is these days a partner at the law firm of Jacobson, Burton and Kelly. That is not relation to me. But Jacobson, Burton and Kelly, and previous to his law firm work, Jeff worked at Honeywell and at Booz Allen in senior compliance roles there. There's a lot of experience with these trade compliance issues and things like that. Jeff, welcome to you as well.
Thank you, Matt. And I have been here once before.
How could I forget?
Always
Every time feels like the first time with you, Jeff, though, you know?
I keep it fresh.
And then, as always, for listeners, if you have questions about what you would like us to discuss, feel free to put that either in the attendee chat or submit it to the Q&A, and it will get fed to us. In theory, we'll save Q&A for the last 10 minutes or so, but in practice, if you ask a really good question, I'm probably just going to put that to our guests as soon as we have it. So feel free to speak up. The more you help us on what we should talk about, the better this, more informative it can be for you. I guess my first question, and I will probably put it to, let's say Lila first, and then Jeff, and then Nick. What do you worry about foremost right now for supply chain risks in 2026, and why? Is it new risks, or is it existing risks that are getting worse? Is it export? Is it tariffs? Is it cybersecurity and procurement stuff? What is the worry that you would look around and you tell people to keep your eye on? Lila, and then Jeff, and then Nick, wrapping up.
Yeah, so I think, all of those are current risks that are happening. And I feel like most of those risks are increasing versus decreasing, right? We've got a regulatory environment that is just getting more and more complex and chaotic and hard to predict. One of the things that I've made a point about on the export compliance side is just that we no longer have the kind of long runway to export compliance changes that we used to. So if we think about the traditional process that we've had for U.S. export compliance changes, is that you had a notice of proposed rulemaking, and you had a Federal Register notice, and you had a notice and comment period, and then you had a final rule announced and an implementation period given. And then you look at the BIS 50% rule, which it was suspended. Yes, it's suspended right now. That's great. But when it was announced and made effective the very following day. And you didn't have that kind of preparation time to be able to get ready for this. It was just, we're announcing it today, it's effective tomorrow, good luck, right? And so then that's what I see a lot in this regulatory environment now. So one is just like it's become so much more dynamic and faster moving. The other thing that I really am thinking a lot about is multi-jurisdictional compliance, where I think a lot of times that we can get very ethnocentric in really just thinking about the compliance risks that we have in the country that we're headquartered in for our organization. And increasingly, we have to really be thinking about all of these different jurisdictions where we're exposed to different risks, especially as we see divergence in different standards among the regulations, right? Where I think, in terms of like data privacy, it's very common to say, well, we're going to comply to GDPR and just use that as kind of our worldwide standard. But things are starting to change a little bit, right? Where not everyone is following some of those same rules. Export compliance is starting to diverge a little bit, where you're starting to see some more, expansion of foreign direct product like rules from other countries. And so then trying to keep that straight of what's the regulatory universe that I'm really even exposed to and managing risks for that. That's, I think, the major top of mind point for me.
All right. And then, Jeff, give me your thoughts, too. I'm hearing a lot of uncertainty or unpredictability. I'm hearing a lot about accelerated compliance demands that happen right away, a lot of just fractured compliance demands worldwide. What do you keep an eye on? What do you think is getting harder right now in 2026?
I think the biggest differential between today's challenges and the last, let's say, 5-10 years is the return of a high duty import dynamic. And generally speaking, I want to sort of make a sort of high level principled statement, which is, supply chain risk is another flavor of third party risk management. Mm-hmm. Although we also have to recognize that the issues and the risks do start upstream from the third parties with whom you have direct contractual relationships. But it is a third party risk management flavor. We don't really think about customs as a third party risk management issue because we really haven't. So to directly answer your question, what's the biggest risk that I'm worried about? What's new? What's really different? It's supply chain fraud in the form of false country of origin in order to avoid what are now very high duties, not just in the US, but other markets who have been raising duties on US goods incrementally as a response to the IEEPA tariffs, the Liberation Day tariffs, the sectoral tariffs, and what have you. This risk lands at your doorstep in the form of customs enforcement or even Department of Justice enforcement, including False Claims Act exposure. And just to sort of distill why it's different, we all grew up in an era of decreasing duties and very low duties. And when there's low duties, there's low incentive to engage in any kind of fraud, origin fraud, classification fraud, what have you, smuggling, what have you. As soon as the duties go back up, all these incentives to engage in supply chain chicanery come back with a vengeance. So it comes to your doorstep in the form of reliance on your suppliers to say these goods come from this market and have this country of origin and will trigger this duty. But you have to recognize that suppliers are right now in operating in an environment where the incentives to be dishonest or for Chinese companies, for example, to engage in obfuscation of origin of parts and components, those incentives have never been higher. The other way it lands at your doorstep is in the form of anti-bribery and anti-corruption risk. So if there are people in your organization or authorized agents that are playing a role in any unlawful duty diversion schemes in any country of origin obfuscation, it's not just a False Claims Act issue, it's not just a customs issue, it's potentially going to be a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act issue and so on and so forth. So to me, that is the biggest new source of pain that really has come back with a vengeance. You hear the administration talk about this in terms of transshipment, but that's really what they mean. They're trying to make sure that goods come from certain places. The universe of suppliers doesn't operate that way yet. And so the suppliers are going to have a lot of incentives to cheat the system.
Yeah, and I think that I was just going to say there's a lot of things going on right now that could contribute to that as well. We've already got this high tariff environment, but we've got, proposals on the Hill right now to have a bill to eliminate first sale, right? So they're looking at eliminating first sale as an option. Well, that's a huge program used by a lot of importers to reduce their duty savings. So then you're eliminating a really popular duty mitigation tool. There's also a proposal in work right now where they would eliminate non-resident importers in the United States as well. They're looking at being able to eliminate that, which I think also then contributes to you're going to have more fraud. You're going to have, all sorts of schemes like that. And in some cases, I think it's importers who don't realize that that's what's going on, right? Where it's not knowing fraud of customs. It's where they've got, a third party or maybe their supplier coming to them and telling them, hey, there's this way that we can save on duties, right? I had a number of clients ask questions about this, last year once the tariffs started hitting about, hey, our supplier says that we can, move these goods from China to Thailand, and then we can claim Thailand country of origin for import into the United States to evade the China duties, because it's the Thailand country of origin laws that apply to freight forwarders. Like, none of that makes sense at all. But good try, right? But it's things where they weren't coming to me and saying, I'd like to commit fraud. They're saying, hey,
Right.
they've told me that there's this way that we can reduce our duties. Let's go do this, because those incentives are out there. And a lot of those Chinese suppliers they're trying to keep their customers, right? So they're trying to figure out ways to keep that business.
So, Nick, give me your thoughts to some of that, and in particular to a good point one of the listeners has already raised, where he says, my biggest concern is the inevitable meeting of these new risks, which Lila and Jeff have laid out in rather hair-raising detail, but meeting of the new risks with technical and compliance debt, which is a fancy way of saying, I don't have the capabilities yet to deal with everything that this world is throwing me. And I do think that's going to be a big problem with a lot of compliance teams is, we don't have the structures, we don't have the oversight, we don't quite know how to think it through. But Nick, what would your reaction to all of this be so far?
Well, that sounds like a Chris King special right there. But to me, that seems like the biggest risk in general. We have these sort of rigid structures or these rigid risk management apparatuses that are not flexing in, quickly enough with the changing incentives. I mean, Jeff talked about it, and so did Layla. These changing incentives create new risks. If you overly rely on an exporter who is trying to maintain that business with kind of a sneaky way, and you're inadvertently creating, an FCPA violation or something like that. Like that's a massive risk that like our current sort of rigid, crystalline, compliance structures are not sort of built to like flex into. And I think when, that's coupled with a likely, and I think, it's been alluded to, a likely like underestimation of the new risk environment at the executive level, where they're treating, tariff evasion as like a, like a parking ticket or something like that. It sets us in compliance up in a really tough spot. So I think kind of coupled with that, one other piece I think is the risk of looking at each of these pieces as like individual, risks when actually it's one risk. I mean, COVID showed us the overall fragility of the supply chain systems, right? Like there were little, pinch points in the hose, and then, the throughput was cut off very, very quickly. There is a fragility of trust at scale inherent to these systems when they're not flexing in response to these changing incentives.
Well, I agree with that. And in fact, Jeff, and then maybe Lila, give me your thoughts on this. One thing I struggle with is whether, when we say supply chain risk, is that too big of an umbrella with too many different things shoved under it that like we don't know how to handle it. I don't know how many companies have a chief supply chain risk officer. I imagine some do, but I suspect those are more like they're thinking procurement and just, can I make sure I have all of the stuff? But now there's a lot more to supply chain risk. And so I still don't know, is this a compliance officer responsibility? Is it a procurement officer responsibility? If it's a team responsibility, that's a nice way of saying we don't know who's supposed to be in charge and who's accountable. So I'm kind of struggling with, is this just too big of a term right now for everything we have to worry about? And that's why we don't have the right capabilities yet. Like Jeff first, and then Lila. What do you say, or what do you think about that?
I would say it's absolutely a procurement and supply chain responsibility, because that is the entry point for the risk.
Okay.
But I would also say that if you're a compliance officer working within the compliance organization or under the legal umbrella or whatever your organizational structure is, supply chain and procurement should absolutely be one of your top 3 or 4 partners, just like you're partnered with HR, just like you're partnered with channel sales, just like you're partnered with your other go-to-market functions. But if we go back to the point I made, supply chain and procurement is the entry point for these risks in terms of the four walls of your company, right?
Yeah.
And so if you have a large supply chain organization and there's somebody or somebody's in that organization that wears the hat of supply chain compliance, maybe they're currently looking at things like counterfeit goods. Maybe they're looking at things like, did the supplier sign our code of conduct, some basic bread and butter stuff. We really have to start thinking about expanding their lens and covering these other issues if they're not already. And if you think about it like a larger organization, I'm going to be a little biased because I work for big companies, Hewlett Packard, Honeywell, Booz Allen. Your supply chain risk management, your supply chain compliance function should really be a partnership led by compliance and supply chain, but also involving your customs people, involving your ESG people, involving your environmental people, and so on and so on and so forth. And I know that sounds overwhelming if you're the supply chain compliance team leader, but again, your responsibility is not to know everything when you're in that role. Your responsibility is to understand the triggers of risk that require additional process, additional diligence, additional risk management. And that's where the compliance officers have to educate those folks on how to recognize that. And from a technical perspective, ideally, you're running some technology platform that can help administer the identification and mitigation of those risk flags, right? But that's a large organization where you've got big teams, multiple teams that can collaborate and attack this together. For medium and smaller size organizations, I would say it really starts with knowing precisely what your risk is. So much of what Lila and I are talking about is fairly universal, but a lot of it is not, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are going to be companies who have a much simpler risk profile. And I'd say this is where it's good to invest some time in external consultants who can help demystify things. But one of the best things you can do as a compliance officer with a small organization is eliminate the application of risk through risk assessment and recognize that this will almost never happen to my company, and I can take a different risk management approach as opposed to other risks that may be very prevalent. So try not to treat all these risks as the same kind of dark cloud coming overhead. You've really got to size it up and figure out, is this my problem, or is it a big problem for the company down the road, but not necessarily for me?
So
and to that point,
go ahead, Nick.
We have to have those intersection points with these, small or large organization. We have to have these intersection points with the owners of these various groups that Jeff, you just talked about. And part of it is about us imparting our pattern recognition to those folks so that they know when that triggering event happens. And I love what you said about essentially taking that risk-based approach to not view it as everything is everything and I have to do all these things. There's probably a Pareto there. There's probably an 80-20 rule there where you need to focus your efforts on the things that matter most. So great point, Jeff.
I'm going to piggyback off the point you made, which is it's okay to make mistakes. Do you have a culture of compliance where when the mistakes are made, you rectify it quickly and, turn the corner? But anyway, great points, Nick. I totally agree.
Yeah, I think Jeff made a really good point about it being very organization specific, right? Is that the risks that are matter to one organization don't necessarily then are high risk to another organization. I think when we talk about supply chain risk, that is really broad, and that means different things to different people. In my experience, working within organizations that are from hundreds of millions of dollars to many billions of dollars, that when you say supply chain risk, typically they do think procurement. They're thinking about, my sole source suppliers, right? Things like that. But they're not thinking about supply chain security, and they're not thinking about cybersecurity. They're not thinking about trade compliance, right? And that's so much broader. And so to say that there's going to be one owner of supply chain risk, I think is typically unrealistic in an organization, that's just not something that's possible. I have never seen someone in a role of supply chain risk officer in any of the organizations that I've been in. And I would say the largest company that I've been with was, Lockheed Martin, which is about a $70 billion company. And for them, if you said supply chain risk to Lockheed Martin, it's absolutely procurement. That's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about directly managing their suppliers and who they have that are, sole source suppliers that they rely on for critical parts. I think you have to break it down into more easily digestible areas that then you can identify who you have owners over that.
And the lens of procurement is inherently, to your point, going to be a little bit different than the compliance lens. Like their prioritization of what they're solving for and what they're looking for, whether it's redundant suppliers or like, I don't know, like cost optimization or getting the right terms. You know, I'm sure nobody in procurement is going to say, yeah, I don't care about like import risk, but I'm just saying it's not how they acclimate to the world. So when compliance is just kind of like a bumper sticker on that procurement, supply chain management car, the influence that is necessary to actually mitigate risk sort of writ large ends up kind of falling by the wayside, or at least you run the risk of that,
Like one of the things I had noticed lately that put me on the idea we should discuss this is, I keep a very close eye on the job market for compliance officers. And I found that I was seeing a lot of people getting promoted from supply chain analyst to trade compliance person. And I have no doubt that if they got the promotion that they deserved it. But I was thinking, well, it begs the question of where good trade compliance people, where do they come from? And a lot of companies were thinking, this originates from supply chain and procurement, and I wasn't entirely sure if that's the right way to think about it, or and it kind of pointed to what Lila and Jeff, what you've both said, is that it can be a risk thing, but it's I don't know. Does it come out of procurement? If it does, like what do they say in pool terms? It comes with a certain angle and English on the ball. That that's not necessarily what you'd have to worry about. I did want to ask a question, picking up on something you had mentioned earlier, Jeff, where you might have FCPA risks that come to you through the supply chain now. As one of your agents or suppliers says, I have a great way to cut your duties or to avoid the import taxes. We just need to do this. I was somewhat wondering, to what extent can a company that already has a grounding in anti-corruption and some grounding in third-party due diligence there, like how easily can you transfer those skills and experience to this new thing? Because nobody's actually going to come out and say, I have a great fraud opportunity to cut your import.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you have to recognize it. And so how much of a jump is it to go from where we were worrying about anti-corruption to worrying about supply chain risks? And Jeff, what would you say to that first?
It's a really great question. I'm going to make a generalization. Usually anti-corruption professionals are excited about somebody coming to them and saying, I've got a new risk and you need to be aware of it. But at the same time, they're not going to necessarily proactively be signing up for that CLE that says, learn about customs fraud and how it intersects with anti-corruption and anti-bribery statutes. So I think it's really incumbent on whoever owns customs compliance risk in your organization. And I recognize that might be one person who has a big team, or it might be one person who shares 7 or 8 different compliance roles under one hat. But whoever it is that is responsible for making sure your life as a customs compliant entity, life as an importer isn't a nightmare, that's the person who should be taking these new risks to the people responsible for anti-bribery and anti-corruption and explaining to them that the incentives have changed. There are enforcement cases that you can look at in recent history that involve customs, by the way. So it's not like you don't have a recent history to rely on. So you can use those enforcement. One of Hewlett Packard's, when I was there, FCPA issues involved customs fraud. But you can use the history, use the new risks factors that are screaming for attention and say, hey, I think we need to reassess and modernize how we do fraud detection in the procurement and supply chain space, and really make sure that we are aligning the controls or building the controls to this new risk dynamic. Because I think, this supply chain shifts that are happening right now are going to be continuing for, a 5, 10, 15-year period. And these are, look, I have nothing personal against Chinese suppliers, but as these Chinese suppliers are faced with more barriers, they're not going to go away. They're going to take their money, they're going to take their equipment, they're going to take their inputs and move them to Malaysia, to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to Thailand, et cetera. And it's not just China, but that's just one focus area. So you've got to take this evidence from the customs center of excellence that exists in your company to the anti-corruption center of excellence that exists in your company and say, we need to make sure that we build or enhance the way we're looking at supply chain risk.
And again, use that recent evidence, use those recent stories to like have a conversation and just assess. I mean, you could do a real-time risk assessment through a conversation. Say, hey, is this a risk, or do we feel like we have the right controls in place around these things that are showing up, in the recent history?
Yeah, and it's going to take a little bit more. I mean, for those of you who are listening and may have a really large organization, I'm going to tell one very quick anecdote here. But I was at a conference in October, and a U.S. government official was telling me about an investigation that they were working on. A Vietnamese manufacturer had been visited by a U.S. importer. The U.S. importer went to the manufacturer, and it looked like everything was pretty compliant. They had all the machinery they needed. The inputs, according to the documents that were going into these finished goods, were not Chinese origin. Everything looked great. What later was determined to be the case is this Vietnamese manufacturer bought a warehouse, staged everything, including the fake documents, in order to pass the diligence audit with the U.S. supplier. That's the extent to which people will try to convince you. I know you might think that we're, getting our stuff from China and it might be subject to those duties under the transshipment rules, but come visit us. We'll show you that that's not the case. The old tactics may not even be good enough, right? If an on-site audit isn't going to cover you, you really have to think creatively about how to tackle this risk going forward.
Yeah, so maybe you got to move to Thailand. But I mean, to your point, they're going to solve for the outcome. They've made investments. The landscape has changed, and they're trying to solve for different things than we're trying to solve for. So they're going to take those kind of Ocean 11 style steps.
First, might I point out that, Jeff, what you just described sounds very much people of a certain age in the Northeast will remember. That's the Crazy Eddie fraud in Long Island when he had the fake warehouses with the fake stereo equipment. But Lila, give me your thoughts on this. That I think Jeff, raises some really good points. That fraud is fraud. There are different versions of fraud, but to what extent do you think, Lila, that you could bring some anti-corruption perspective and experience, like it would still transfer over to what we're talking about, and trying to root out what the potential scams are, getting people to speak up about the potential scams, things like that. Like, to what extent does our prior experience overlap with what we're talking about here now with supply chain issues?
Yeah, I think this is why it's critical for compliance to have a really close relationship with the logistics department that is managing the providers that are doing, brokerage and forwarding, and really looking at, what's the profile of these organizations? How many different providers are we using? What kind of agents do they use? What kind of anti-bribery, anti-corruption programs do they have? It needs to go beyond what historically it was, which is just, well, I'm going to send them this statement as part of my due diligence practice, and they're going to sign off and say, yes, I agree to your anti-bribery, anti-corruption policy. Yeah, great. But what's the real meat digging into it? Do they have a vast network of third-party agents that they're using that they don't have any visibility to the accounting for those? Or is it something where mostly they're owned branches that are all billing through the same system, where you would notice if there's a very weird payment to customs, right? So those are the types of things that you need to be looking for, those types of questions that you need to ask. But you need to tell people why that's even relevant to them, right? And so then it's explaining, why does your logistics person need to know about anti-bribery, anti-corruption? Well, here's why. Here's some recent examples where, there were FCPA violations because of customs fraud, right? Here's the risk. That's what's really important, is really driving it home on why it's relevant and getting the right people involved to then be able to have that as part of your risk assessment.
It's interesting that one of the listeners there commented a few moments back that they thought one good place to find trade compliance people might be in your transportation and logistics function, if your business has one, just what you were saying, Lila. Also glad to see everybody who remembers the Crazy Eddie fraud. Thank you for outing yourself as a member of Gen X, while the millennium Gen Z secretly Google who was Crazy Eddie. But it was,
and then we just act like we remember.
I wanted to say, one of the best trade compliance people I ever had, she came from a customer service role. And so then I think that, one of the things that can be really important is someone with institutional knowledge, someone who knows where the skeletons are hiding, where the bodies are buried. To use a terrible analogy. But, one of the great things about her was she didn't have specific compliance knowledge, but she knew the organization super well.
Mm-hmm.
So she understood the way that the supply chain worked for the organization. And then once I got her the training on specifically how the trade compliance concepts worked, she knew who to talk to, right? She knew how to get that information, how to get our suppliers to do their CTPAT assessments, how to work with this customer to change their Incoterms, right? Or whatever it may be. And so I think that good compliance people can come from lots of different backgrounds. It's more so about someone who's got the right mindset for compliance, right? That they're not like, oh God, this is the dullest stuff I've ever read, but that, gets excited about international trade and about the prospect of doing these things. Someone who's detail oriented and someone who can deal with ambiguity and gray areas and then try to make sense of that problem. I think that's those kinds of skills that are so much more important than the specific role they've come from.
I would agree 100%. Yet again, reminding us that a successful compliance, this is more of a people job than a legal or technology job pretty much every day of the week. One question I had, Jeff, maybe I'll put this to you first and then Lila and then Nick. To what extent do organizations, are they trying to rethink are they thinking about this at a strategic level? Because for a long time in FCPA enforcement, that was a compliance exercise we did at the end, and we're not going to think about it. If we pay bribes, we'll get out of it or something to that effect. But it took a long time before businesses really bought into the idea that clean business was a good thing. Right. And thinking about strategically, do we deal with agents? Do we not? I kind of wonder, where are we on thinking about supply chain risks? And could a good supply chain risk officer go to senior management and say, we really should rethink our whole sourcing strategy because this is going to be quite painful? I don't know if senior management wants to hear about that or have those discussions, or are the supply chain compliance thinkers too low in the organization and won't necessarily get the airtime with senior management? To what extent can we sort of elevate this discussion to that higher level, do you think? What do you see?
So I'm going to go back to something Nick mentioned. I think the COVID disruption to supply chain helped finish off any ambiguity that existed as to whether supply chain should be more of a strategic consideration as opposed to just a speed and cost consideration. And once you have the COVID disruption combined with US and European policies that are trying to decouple technological reliance on China,
yep,
and you have the massive disruptions caused by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and you have massive malware attacks in the United States impacting some really large companies and ransomware events. These things, to me, ended what was like a 10-year conversation of how strategic should we be with supply chain. Because
exactly.
It had been the case, in my opinion, that speed and cost was winning out over the people who had roles like I did, who were saying we should be more strategic and more risk-oriented, not focused on speed and cost. I think that conversation's largely over now, unless you're trading in really commoditized goods with not a lot of national security interest. So I think we're there at the executive level, at the leadership level. And this is a good thing for all compliance officers. It's a great thing for all compliance lawyers. What it means is you're no longer going to be going to these leaders and feeling like you have to convince them that this is something. Instead, you can go to them and say, this is the way it is. Our peers are thinking more strategically. Our customers are demanding us think more strategically. Our suppliers are demanding us to think more strategically. So it's not me as the compliance person saying, let's take a more risk-oriented lens to our procurement and supply chain. It's when are we going to catch up with the reality that we must be? We need to have supply chain closer, not faster. We need to have supply chain less exposed to geopolitical risk, China, Russia, what have you. Those considerations, if they're not in the mix now, companies are falling behind. So I think the conversation is largely over, and like we have to be strategic, and it's really a function of whether your company is in the peloton, is ahead of the pack, or lagging.
Lila, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think what I've seen is that in terms of like the tariffs portion of the risk, that I feel like that 2026 is the year where I think companies are moving out of the denial stage of grief and into the acceptance stage, right? Of saying, okay, I thought maybe, they were going to realize this was nuts to have all of these crazy tariffs and that they were going to go away, and that's not happening. And that, looking at the Section 301 tariffs, those didn't all go away when the administration changed from Trump to Biden. And so then these tariffs aren't probably going to all go away when we get our next president for 2028, 2029, right? And so then now this is the new reality. To Jeff's point, what do we do now? Right now, we have to rethink this, where it's no longer about just the lowest possible material cost at the right quality that I can get from a single supplier, but overall, what's my supply chain strategy? Overall, what's my manufacturing strategy in light of tariffs, but then also in light of export controls, right? There's more of these companies who are looking at that strategically and saying, how do I want to structure my supply chain so that I am, making the best use of, the export compliance, regulations that I'm subject to. And that's a conversation where, again, compliance has to be really, really ingrained with procurement and supply chain when they are having those discussions, not when the decision's already made and they're already, switching stuff over, but early in the discussion. There was a very recent, very large BIS penalty, something in the range of, I think, $252 million is what it was for export violations. And part of what happened there is that they decided to bifurcate their manufacturing process, to do it as a two-part process, part in the U.S., part in Korea, to be able to evade the export licensing requirement from the U.S. That didn't work, right? Because it was not compliant what they were doing. They actually involved their compliance team. If you look at the full charging letter, and their compliance team just interpreted things incorrectly in telling them that it was something that they were able to do. But that's absolutely the types of discussions that we need to be having.
Another question I do have is ultimately the refereeing of who gets to decide on these supplier questions. We haven't talked much about, say, the first line operating units. And for a lot of businesses, if you don't have a centralized procurement function, I'm guessing a lot of these units will just say, okay, I'm in charge of supplying my own things. I found this supplier. They're really good. I want them. Does the compliance officer get to have a veto over that? I can imagine that might be difficult at some points. Or if you have a really attractive supplier on price, or who is in the US and there's no tariff question, but they're terrible on cybersecurity and you can't get assurance there, does the CISO get to veto that? Because there are so many different risks, I could see that there are so many different voices in the enterprise who all want to say, I should be able to veto this. And then I think that, that's a recipe for overly, or working across purposes and too many cooks in the chef. And I wonder how you keep track of something like that. Jeff, how would you try and sort out that problem first, and then Lila, and then Nick?
So I'm just organizationally, I'd rather have too many cooks than not enough. It just,
Fair.
It's you don't want either. But if the risk is there, I want the risk owner to be in the conversation. Now, that doesn't mean they have to be in the kitchen, to continue the metaphor, for forever. But you need to have the people who feel like their risks are at stake, a way to implement the risk controls into the procurement supply chain process. And then you become a service provider, a conduit of information to that risk owner so that they can exercise their veto. And again, I would argue in terms of, are there too many veto powers? I would say no. Again, I would rather have the risk owners each be responsible for a predictable, transparent standard of unacceptable risk, and have each one of, whether it's 4 people or 8 people, and say, this meets my standard for acceptable risk. We can proceed with this relationship with this new key supplier. I think that's the way you want to try to tackle it. So in other words, don't make everything an unbound meeting of every stakeholder. but try and make sure that everyone justifies their risk so that they deserve to be part of the recipe, and then figure out how to create a standard to identify and measure that risk. And then you become in supply chain a conduit of information to the risk owner so that they can approve the veto. Yes, you could theoretically have proxies make these decisions for other people. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I wouldn't want to do that unless the risk owner said, I'm comfortable that you can apply the standard. You tell me if things are ambiguous and you need my input. That's also perfectly acceptable. But one thing I would caution against is, there's nothing meritorious inherently about one person or a small group of people making these decisions, unless they're well trained and unless they're representing the true requirements of the other stakeholders and risk owners.
Lila, what would you say to all this? I can appreciate where Jeff is going with the logic. I still am sort of congenitally spooked by the idea of many different people having a potential veto. But how would you recommend people approach this?
Well, I think in practice that I don't see very many people having that veto. In what I've seen is that typically procurement gets what procurement wants. Where if they've said, nope, this is the supplier when we really want them, then that they're going to see what they can do contractually to try to mitigate that risk. And then they're going to decide that, whatever they can't mitigate, they're just going to accept, right, as a risk. I will say, I do think that cybersecurity has become elevated enough at the C-suite level that I have seen a cybersecurity issue derail a supplier, where they're just like, nope, they don't have appropriate cyber insurance. We're just not going to use them, right? If they're not willing to do that, then that's just a no. But I think it can be really hard for compliance to have that veto power. I don't usually see that. I see it more as compliance ends up advising, hey, I don't recommend this. Here are the risks. But then they're looking for, then what can I do in the contractual agreement to account for those risks? Not, I'm not going to use that supplier because of that risk. I do think the more people that you have in that decision-making process, the more bloated the process becomes. And so then you are now running counter to, I think, what most organizations want, which is to be more nimble, right? We're talking about an overall business environment that is more dynamic and moving faster, and where you're expected to be able to streamline these things. And so you're much less likely to get approval to have 10 different functions or approvers in a process for a supplier. They're going to want to cut that down. But at the end of the day, I think most of the time compliance doesn't get veto power. You just have to be able to see what the risks are, articulate those risks, offer some risk mitigation, options, and hope that those suggestions get taken.
I love the idea of like a flag and escalate, right? If a compliance, is not going to have veto power, which particularly is never going to happen in a large organization. To your point, Jeff talked about those pre-escalation paths. I think that's smart, right? To kind of, in certain situations, we have some certain standards that can kind of, dictate how something gets escalated. At the end of the day, though, it's going to be tough. Like to the example you just gave, cyber's been such a big issue. It's top of mind for everybody, and it's sort of, you can come up with like a deterministic conclusion because you can tie it to a piece of insurance or something that like can cover it. That's a very easy decision to make. A lot of the compliance risk is so amorphous, it's hard to kind of pinpoint to one thing to kind of capture that sort of executive attention. So it's inherently very difficult, which again kind of comes back to this importance of having those, we say this all the time, but it's true because it applies in like almost every single situation. It's important to have those relationships, and it's important to be able to speak the language of the business. Talking just about risks to somebody who has a different risk appetite to you at a higher level in the organization might not resonate. Talking about incentives and pointing back to the COVID thing, like Jeff was saying about the fragility of it and what that would translate to the stock price, that now reframes the conversation in terms that might resonate with somebody a little bit more. There's no like silver bullet with this stuff though, because there's inherent complexity, and we're inherently looking at it from, a different vantage point or through a different lens that most other people aren't sort of primarily viewing these problems or these risks through.
Yeah, and I think it's to recognize that you have a limited amount of political capital, right? Everybody has this limited amount of political capital within the organization. What are you going to go to the mat on, with that political capital.
What hill are you going to die on? Exactly.
What hill are you really going to die on? And so then sometimes if it's a supplier where you're like, hey, you know what? They've got a recent, bribery or corruption conviction. This is a really bad idea. You might want to fight real hard on that one. If it's one where it's like, they don't meet all of my CTPAT, supply chain security minimums, criteria, maybe that's one where you're like, I'm not going to fight you on this one. I'm just going to offer up, these are things I'd suggest that you put in the contract, or these are corrective actions that I'd like to implement once they're on board or something like that, right? So you got to make your own risk-based decision about how hard are you going to go.
Exactly.
I suppose I still have some concern for compliance officers that, you can certainly point out the risks to the supposed risk owners, and then they say, well, you know what, we're going to work with the supplier anyways. But then when the bad thing happens, if it does, there are a lot of risk owners who have a funny habit of turning around to compliance and say, well, why didn't you stop me from this? Or you should have told me. And one of our listeners did point out that this reminds us yet again to document everything. And I do think that documenting the thought process and then assigning risk ownership to somebody who is not you, who insists on this, is going to be crucial. But risk owners have a funny way of trying to avoid it once the risk ownership actually.
Exactly.
That's why your risk advisory is in writing and you save a copy of that email.
Jeff, any other thoughts?
I would agree.
there?
And I think standards, right? Like it doesn't matter what you call it. I like to call it acceptable risk, or the standard I say is always achieve acceptable risk. You have to define what that means for each of the risk owners, right? So if I was in charge of compliance for customs, I would have factors that basically say if this is present in a supplier and we can't get rid of it, I'm going to label it unacceptable risk. That doesn't mean, depends on the context. If I was at Honeywell, for example, when we were in consent agreements and DPAs, that would be a basis for a veto power. A lot of other companies, it's just a recommendation. But if you're identifying something against a regular standard, and if there's clear, distinction when you say this is unacceptable risk, you're responsible for mitigating that risk. I'm not in compliance. That's not my job. I think that's an important part of the approach. A corollary to that, if you render that unacceptable risk decision as to a supplier and they want to do it anyway, and you're not comfortable that they know how to mitigate the risk, that's another issue that you're going to want to escalate somewhere, right? Like, look, they're going to proceed with this, and I don't know that the mitigation plan they have is adequate for the risk we've identified. It's important that you know that, leader X, right? And maybe that's, your chief compliance officer, maybe that's your business leader for that particular unit. But don't do this ad hoc. Every risk owner should have a concept that is well defined in terms of what is and what is not acceptable risk. And that's the way that you basically protect your reputation and defend against the accusation that you said this was okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. And then you have something objective that you can debate about to say, like, okay, well, if you don't like this framework or how I'm sort of scoring these risks, then I can point to it. And it's not just this, the animal spirits are determining how I feel today about some like ad hoc risk discussion that we're having. It's smart, and it's I don't know. I think you said it preserves your political capital to some degree.
Yeah, I think going back to the political capital, that's why if you can offer solutions, right, instead of I just want to veto, right, is that you are going to be seen as much more practical. You are, helping to facilitate business, and then that way, when you really do have one where you're like, hey guys, stop, like this is really bad, and we don't have a good way of mitigating this risk, they're much more likely to listen to you than if you're constantly like, this is a bad idea, right?
Right. And again, the more opportunities you have to sort of build that reputation by showing yourself to be common sense, to apply a materiality lens and so forth, it gives a lot more credence to those rare no's that you have to kind of raise your hand or raise that red flag. That's a great point.
So we have about 5 more minutes left. I wanted to squeak in one more.
You can always also think about things incrementally, right? So you can define the relationship over the course of the first year as very limited. If those risks you're worried about don't manifest, then you can approve the business or work with the business to expand it. But there's, even when you're getting to yes, there's always ways that you can sort of contain the risk and sort of get more comfortable over time.
I want to sneak in one more question, more about like the tactics of how to handle sub-suppliers and the sub-sub-suppliers and whatnot, that I have from time to time said that it's not really a supply chain anymore. It's more like a supply mesh, that you could have a misconduct issue far removed from you down the supply chain with some sub-supplier. You had no idea they were in your chain, but it leapfrogs up and becomes your problem. One favorite example of mine actually is from the world of Super Bowl commercials, where there was a beer commercial a few years back involving the actors or the actresses were mermaids. And it came out that the video's casting director, like 4 steps away from the beer commercial, the beer owner, like they had been harassing the models who wound up in the commercial. And this blew up the next day after the Super Bowl. And I was like, how on earth do you get visibility that far down your supply chain? And that's, right, I suppose, true whether we're talking about harassment or corruption or tariff evasion or something like that. Like, we really do need to peer multiple ways down to be sure that doesn't suddenly ricochet right back up the supply chain and blow up on your face. Like, how do we handle that? Lila, let me ask you if you could have a minute or two to talk about that, and then Jeff, and then Nick, maybe we could wrap things up after that. But how do we handle
the 2 key points that I would make on that is, one, that supply chain traceability is no longer something that's just a nice to have. That really, that we need supply chain traceability. You need detailed supply chain maps. And whether you are doing that with, Microsoft Visio, or you are going out and you're getting, advanced software and AI tools to help you with that, whichever it is, but there's just too much need to really understand the depths of your supply chain beyond your first tier suppliers to put that off and act like, well, that's a future thing that someday we'll get to, right? So that's the first thing I would say. But the second thing I would say, and it's advice that I would give to anyone in a compliance role, is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Yes, it is possible that 4 steps removed from you, there's going to be some problem that bubbles up. But if that's not reasonable for you to be able to see and predict that, don't let that stop you from doing the things that you can control right now, the things that you can improve right now. And sometimes we as compliance professionals, we want everything to be so great and perfect and completely covered and all of our risks mitigated that you can get into analysis paralysis and forget to just take care of what you can control right now.
All right. Jeff, what's your take on the supply mesh issue and the sub-suppliers?
I think it's a good analogy because all of these suppliers are relying on software providers to run their business. They're relying on inputs and materials to create their goods. It's a very apt analogy. I'm very comfortable with it. I endorse it. What I would say from a techniques perspective and a capabilities perspective, there's probably nothing exotic that's needed here. It's the same tools that we think of that are relevant for supply chain risk management or third-party risk management, but maybe with a little bit more intensity and maybe with a little bit more proactive governance. So there's only so much you can do when you're onboarding and assessing suppliers. You should be robust with that process. You should have an onboarding process. It should be heavily focused on compliance risk as well as financial and performance risk. That's not new or exotic. That's important when it comes to direct and indirect supply chain risk. So screening and diligence is still really important. Contract-based consequences for not following contract-mandated compliance and transparency is another really important mechanism. There's nothing preventing you in a contract from saying you commit not to using these kinds of suppliers or doing business with these kinds of people, but you have to give that teeth. You have to do something every once in a while that basically demonstrates that provision you demand as part of every contract has meaning. Right. So a good way to test your third-party risk management or supply chain management risk process is to ask, when was the last time that we booted a supplier from our universe because they didn't do the right thing? If the answer is never, but you have something that you think is a really robust supply chain risk approach, I would question whether it's that robust. If everybody gets approved and nobody gets consequences, that doesn't sound like the real world we live in today. So, have contract-based consequences, but make sure that there's governance mechanisms to actually enforce them every once in a while. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to do expensive audits, but, figure out some way that you can make sure that, the bad actors get some attention that could reasonably lead to discovery of their bad acts.
All right. We'll have to leave it there because we're pretty much out of time here. But Lila Landis and Jeff Schwartz, you both covered a lot of ground for us, gave us a lot to think about. Thank you very much. Nick, I'll let you wrap it up and take it home.
Well, let's get a massive round of applause here. I mean, this was like such a phenomenal session. So glad to have you back, Jeff. Lila, phenomenal. Matt, as always, you are the king of this this game. So next week, we got a couple of great episodes on, if you guys can drop. So I was at a conference recently and somebody recommended that we start doing kind of a series of like business 101 sessions on the Ethicsverse. So drop some ones in the chat if you'd like to do that. And we'll start planning that and working those in. But just to better speak the language of business, understand some of these concepts that maybe CFO is talking about or the board is talking about, whatever. If you'd like to see some of those, drop some ones in the chat. I'm hoping to see 1,000 ones because I'm only seeing thumbs right now. Next week, we have Ethico University on Tuesday. We're going to be talking about automating workflows and structuring investigations to drive better outcomes, drive more investigative equity, and drive some more efficiency in your process. And then next Thursday, coolest place to be, we have the one and only Matt Kelly back once again, and we're going to be talking about upskilling compliance, building strong teams for today and tomorrow. These are 2 sessions you do not want to miss. So 1,000 ones, it looks like we're going to have to do it. Okay, you guys are all going to get MBAs soon. So thank you guys all for joining. Hope you enjoyed it. Tell your friends, tell your team. This is the place to be every Tuesday and Thursday. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.